Continuing with tuples, episode 2, we already have discussed about what tuple is and what are the usage scenarios where you can use it. So today is an implementation day where we will look at how to implement tuples. So topics which we will cover today for tuples are as follows. Simple tuple definition, how you can define it, then name tuples, creating tuples, which is like instantiating a tuple and then setting new values to it, then defining types to tuple, or how does type work for a tuple, and then what is a empty tuple, does it have any significance, we'll look into that. Then returning values as tuple, this is more like when you have your tuple defined as a return values for a function. In that case, how can you use it? Then finally, the important thing, which is the 7 point, then which is passing functions or closures as values to a tuple. This is very important because this will be used majorly in the application which we are building. So we have to actually look at that aspect very interestingly, because that is one of the things which we will be defining or using to a great extent in the project which we are creating, the e-commerce application. So let's get started with the implementation, starting with the simple tuple. So I already have defined a view controller. It's already created a project for this. I have defined view controllers and have set some default values which I just need to reuse while we are implementation things. I also have a function called start tuple where I'll be creating or using that for setting these different examples. So I have the 6 to 7 examples to show. So that will all be happening within the start tuple function. So without much delay, let's get started with the first thing, which is defining a simple tuple. So that's the first thing, simple tuple example. It's nothing but let's start with something as simple as creating a user tuple. That's how you define a tuple. And if you have to have some values inside, you will have, let it be a John Doe. That's my first value, John Doe. So this is my simple tuple user, which is having these values, which are two string values, John Doe. So this, I can look at it as the first name and last name of a user. So if I have to, let's say, print it out, user is user dot. So you will get as many number of values you are defining. Let's say in this case we are defined 2. You'll get those kind of indices 0 and 1 in this case, which will actually represent those values in that order. So 0 is my first name, which will print out the John part, and if I have to give a space and print the second part, which is 1, that is the second part, user first name last name, user is first name last name. Let's try running this and see whether it's printing or not. So you can see that it's picking up those values. User is John Doe, that is what is getting printed now. So that's the easiest way of defining a tuple. Usage is pretty simple like this. So that being completed, let's get into something where in this case you knew that 0 is the first name and 1 is the last name, but in cases where you don't really know what is a parameter that you're receiving, you might need a name to be defined for these values. So that's the second example where we will define a name to the tuple. Before that, let me just have some images set here, which I'll just use to say that this part is completed, just a representation for this tutorial. So that's completed now. Let me just run this application so that you'll just see what I meant. So you can see that tick mark right now, it's completed. So that's it. simple example is now completed. So if let's say even if you extend it to something like age of this person, let's say 34, so that can also be printed here, and age is user, so that it's showing the kind of type. So overall it has different types here, so even it is coming as part of index 2. If you run that again, let's see what is getting printed. So you see user is John Doe and age is 34. So that's pretty much how you define a simple tuple. So let's get on with the next one, which is like a name tuple example, where I'll define a same thing. Maybe let me just call it as named user. Let that be a simple similar thing. Maybe I'll just call this as Jill Doe, who's 25 age. Now let me give some names to these values so that it's easier for usage. Let's call it as first name, last name, and age. So you see that it's being defined like you separate it with a colon and separate these values with a comma. That's how you define it. So let's now print this and see what's the result that you get. So named user is same thing. So let's use it as named user, age. But the difference here is that you see first name, last name, and age. So this is called as a type tuple. Sorry, not typed, it's name tuple. So you define a name and then that is available for access when you are putting that dot. So that's how it works. So let's see whether that get printed. So you can see that the named user is also now printed. So that's how the named tuple works. So let's make that as completed. Name tuple completed. Completed is nothing but I have set an image which is having this. So I'm just calling that whenever we are completing that tutorial. So that's also completed. Let's get on with the next one, which is creation of a tuple. So creating a tuple. So that's more like instantiating with some default value. So let me just call it as create user. Nothing. It has maybe I'll just call it as first name, empty, last name, empty, age is also maybe some default value. You can even define it as nullable types, even it accepts. Maybe no. Okay, it needs a type there. That's the reason it does not identify it. So it's very strict about types. So just give it as this, but you can actually define it as a type aliasing to actually do this. But let's keep it as defaults right now. So that's my created user. That's how I might just define my tuple like this, creation of my tuple, and then if I have to use it, let's say I create something like I'm creating a superhero out of this. Superhero 1 is create user. I'm just using the same instance, but it's not an instance, it's a value type. So that's how tuple works. Whatever you're passing to a tuple will become a value type. So if you're thinking that this created user is this, superhero is this, then it's not, it will be different. So let me just give you that understanding by this. Bruce superhero, Bruce Banner, I guess. That's our superhero. Maybe I'll just, instead of this age, I'll just call it as super home superhero, or maybe title, that'll work. So superhero dot title is Hulk. So that's pretty much I'm too much excited about the movie Endgame, so I'm too much following these things now. So that's why this. So let's print this out. Okay, so superhero is, print that out. Superhero one dot first name does not make sense. Let's just try to call just the title and see. Superhero is this, and his real name is name, last name. So that's my superhero, Hulk, one of my favorite characters from the Marvel universe. Let's run that and see. So what were we trying to do here? Okay, let me just run that and show you something. So this is my superhero. Superhero is Hulk and his real name is Bruce Banner. So that was not the intention of using but this is more like creating a tuple with this. But I also wanted to show you that superhero is not create user. So if you try to print create user, you will not see anything, because that's instantiated with empty things. So if you see superhero is nothing, it shows the Hulk one, but after that if you see there's no value, because it does not, it's not reset. Okay, that it's not the same instance, it's value type. That's the whole thing which I'm trying to say. So let's get rid of this. So we are done with creating a tuple. So you can even create a second superhero like this, but it will be a totally different value. Superhero 2, let's say. That will obviously be my second favorite. Oh, so that's my second one. And if you print this superhero 2, which should show you the second superhero values again. So you have superhero Hulk and then the Ant-Man one. So that's how you create. Maybe I just can call it as creating a tuple, and then like using that for creating multiple other ones. So we are done with this one as well. Let me just call it as create. What did I call that as? Creating tuple image view. Image is completed. So let's check the status. We are done with 3 out of 7. So that's 3 out of 7. Oh, the last one is still showing us 6. Let me just change that. That's my layout. Okay, I made it as 7, 6, 7. That's it. So let's come back and get to the next one, which is type of a tuple. Tuple type example. It's hardly an example, but just to show you how tuples type works. It's more like tuples type is actually the type of the values that you're having within it. Let's say if you have a tuple with one value, then it'll be that single values type. That is what the tuples type will be. So if you have multiple values, then the overall different types contribute to creating the overall type of that tuple. So it's like whatever values that you're having within that tuple is what defines its type. That's how it works. So in this case also it's like type tuple. Let me just say type tuple just to show you how it works. If I have some values, my name itself, Vish, and then if I have my city's name, and then maybe I'll have the zip code or pin code. We call it pin code in if you're from US or someplace, it's called zip code. So that's the thing. Maybe true or false, something like, I don't know, some param. So this is my tuple. It is having a type of string, then string, again maybe an int, and then again a boolean value. So this is the type of my my tuple. Nothing major here, but if I have to like define it as a type, so my tuple type, so wait, let me just create string int and bool. So that's my, it will not give you any error because this is the type it is conforming to. So that's a type of the overall tuple for me then. So that's about type of a tuple. Nothing to show there, but just to actually tell you tuple type, how it works. So let's keep that as completed. So that's done now. Tuple type definition is done. Next we go to an empty tuple. Nothing major there as well. It's, can we have an empty tuple? It's nothing like it's just that empty tuple. It's nothing but two brackets. That's it. It is actually representing void, nothing more. So we will use this when we are actually creating the application. Empty tuples are necessary in some cases where we might, if you don't have to pass some dependencies to any layer, then we might just be keeping it as empty. That's the reason I just introduced it here. It's an empty tuple. So that's relevance. So that's also possible. And is it possible to have a single value tuple? Yeah, it can be. And in this case, it's more like this tuples type is this single values type. So it's more like you can see the overall Swift, every type or everything is like a tuple. Then if it is a single type, then that is more like something like you are seeing here. It's, so if we'll just stick to this empty one. So that's also done. Empty tuple image completed. That's also done. Now let's go to some more interesting stuff. Did we miss anything? Okay, we did not. So now let's come back to something where we created all the tuples. Let's say we created a superhero, we created a named user, everything. So let's just come back and do something where we need to, let's say, decompose or get the values out of these tuples and then use it. That's called decomposition of a tuple. So let's do something like where if you want the first name, last name, and the title of the superhero, let's just call this superhero 1. Let's use that superhero 1, and then you're doing this will not give you any error because this is more like, you know, that these are the types based on which this is being created. The superhero has a first name, last name, and title. You can call it anything, but I'm just keeping it. Maybe I can call it as first, last, and title. It does not make much difference. And let me just print that out. So this example is decomposing tuples example. So let's print that out. My decomposed, that does not make it sounds bad, but then let me just keep it as decomposed superhero is, just use that title. So let's see whether it is pointing to the same title. Yeah, it is. So that's the decomposed superhero. I tried to just use that one value. So that's my decomposed superhero's Hulk. If I keep it as 2, it'll give me Iron Man. It should. That's my Iron Man. So that's how decomposition works. If you want to have those values within this tuple, that's how you do it. Let's say I don't want to decompose some of these. I just need a title, then I can just do this. It'll work. So decomposition is done, and that was not part of my, after empty tuple I needed a decomposing tuple, which is not there. Let me just add that quickly. Tuple, and I need an outlet to that. Just give me a moment. It is not related to the tutorial, but I'm just keeping it as consistent as possible. Decomposing image view. Okay, that's done. Let's just go back. So here is my decomposing. That's also completed. So let's get on with the next one. And I did not number it properly. 4, 5, 6. Sorry for wasting a little bit of your time. But let's get back to business. Where what am I left with now? The interesting thing, returning values as tuples. So that's related to a function. Let me just quickly write a function. Let me just call it city, get city, state, city, get city, country. So this is more like I pass coordinates. Of latitude and longitude, something like this. This is again a tuple I'm passing as a parameter, and it's interesting to see that I can return a tuple as a return type here. So that's interesting, right? So you have so do some operations with the coordinates and return the city, country, and zip code details. Pin code for me, which is zip code for some countries. So that's some business logic. I'm not implementing that, but then this function does that. It gets you the city, country information. And let me just return, maybe I'll just return whatever my city is, which is Bangalore, and country being India, and some zip code. That's my zip code. So that's what I'm returning. So that's my why it's an int. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to do. Define a function which will return the city details if you're passing the coordinates. So just a simple use case. I'm calling it a use case because I want to use it to show you something very interesting, which will lead to the real usage of the example or the tutorial which we are going to create on the e-commerce application. So stay tuned for that. Don't miss this. This is the biggest part of this tutorial where I have this function. And let's get on with that. The use case is here. So get country, let's call it here. So this example is returning tuple as a return type. Very useful thing if you have, let's say, if you want to pass multiple, if you want to actually return multiple values. Even it is widely used with RX Swift or functional programming, where when you are actually flat mapping or getting a flat map, doing a flat map playtest or something, and if you return something, it's out of context, but I'm just saying that it is very useful to return some values using tuples. So let's just call this function get city country. I'm just passing all whatever I have already defined as latitude and longitude, which is the Bangalore's latitude and longitude. I'm just passing those lat and long. That's my lat and long, and let me just get that value here. City info, that's my city info. So my city info, I just receive it. So once I receive that, again I can access it like 012. Then again you can do something like name it similar to how we have done it. So this is without naming, so it always comes back as 012, which does not make much sense to me. So let me just call it as lat and long, and then the return city, naming it properly, country, and the pin code. So that's my return. That does not give me an error, but right now I'll get it back as named. It's easier that way. So let me just print that one. My city info is city, country, zip or pin code. Print that and see. So that's it. It shows me city info is city Bangalore, India, and the pin code. Yeah, that's how it works. So pretty easy to send back multiple values as return types. So let me just make this as completed, returning complete. That's also completed. And what's left, the biggest part, biggest one, which is quite interesting. I was not aware of it until recently, but I knew that you can pass closures as a tuple value. So that's what we are trying to do right now, and then we'll jump on to something somewhat more interesting, which is what will be the trigger to the e-commerce application usage of interactors. So let's get into that. So first let me just define city info closure. That's my closure. So I have created I have this coordinates, latitude and longitude. So I can define a type aliasing for that latitude and longitude and just directly point that. So even before going that, like I already defined it here. So this is the coordinates which I am receiving. So let me just call it as coordinates. So that's my input or parameter which I pass to this closure, and in response I should get a city info. So that's my closure, and it should return me whatever I had returned earlier here. Let's say, let me just do this, return India. So that's it. You have this closure city info which accepts coordinates, gives you the city values. This closure, let me just create a tuple for that. So let me just call this as passing function. I should call it as passing closures to tuples example. So how does that work? So in this case, as I was talking about creating use cases, let me just create it as a use case itself. So let me create a type alias called use cases, which will, it can be even like an empty. Initially I don't have any use cases, let's say, but then I start defining my use cases like okay, let me just call this as, okay, let that remain as city info. So my city info is my use case, let's say, and it should be of type, this specific type, city coordinates. It accepts city coordinates and returns city info. So this is my closure. First closure, it will give me an error saying I cannot have a single type. Yeah, so let me also add a void. So this is my use case. First use case I have defined is my city info. Just add a bracket. Okay, so my city info is accepting a closure like this, where I pass city coordinates lat and long, and it returns me the city information, this whole thing. So that's my use case, let's say, my city info. So if I have to instantiate this, so let me just create a use cases variable of this specific type, use cases. I need to instantiate that. Okay, where? So that's instantiated. Now if I have to, let's say, instantiate it with the value here, which is the use cases. So it should accept a couple of parameters now. So it needs an argument. We have defined this my city value as one argument, which is accepting a closure of city coordinates, which returns the city info. So we already have this closure defined here, which is city info. So let's use that. My city info, I'm just passing city info as the parameter. The second one is, as per this use cases, it is accepting this and an empty closure and a void value. City info, do I already have it? No. Cannot invoke use case with an argument type. This usage is like you instantiate it with this. Okay, so use cases, variable which you define, which is of specific this type use cases, accept this closure and then void thing. So we are also instantiating it within the view did load using the same parameter name, but calling this city info closure function, which returns a Bangalore, India. It should ideally not be something like this, but it should do some business logic here. That's the ideal scenario, but this is like a sample. So that's being defined here. So whatever we did, we have the use cases now. So we can right now, we have passed this instance of this closure here. So if you call this now as use cases dot what is the function is my city info. It's giving some error. Value of type it's optional. Okay, too many maybe. Optional. Why is it optional? Okay, let's do one thing. Let's really make it optional and do this. Let's do a guard here. And use it. My city info, accepting that same parameter, city coordinates it requires. So we know the type which you need to pass, similar to however we passed in this coordinates. Let's pass that. It will not require that. It will just accept this tuple as the input to it. So let's do the use case result. Print that. Use case city result is, let's just print the city part and see. Use case result dot city. So run it. So hope this is not so complex. It's just that we are passing a closure to a tuple and then we are able to consume it at a different place. So I will explain you as soon as this is done why this is very critical or very important in the context of whatever we are doing. So let's just, because this works now, let's not just make it complete, because one more thing I want to do before ending this. So here we created a closure and then used it within a tuple. Like I created something called as a use case, which is accepting this specific type of that closure, and then as a value. And then if you had multiple functions like this or closures like this, we could have removed this and then added more of those. But in this case, as we have just one closure, we're creating one more with a void type, and this is being defined as a variable, this type, and then we are just instantiating it in the viewDidLoad with that specific closure function which we created. So pretty simple here. And then usage is simply like you call that use cases and that function, pass the parameter, your job gets done with that function. That's what we try to do. And now very something very similar you can do with a function, but not with an instance function, but with a static function. So let's just modify this one and see how you can do the same thing with this function, where it does the same. It accepts a coordinate, returns the city information. So it will just give you an error now, because here it's static, so you'll have to access it through this view controller. So that's sorted now. But then the change that we are going to right now do is let's just let's just get rid of this, and then static city info. So that's more like a second function I'm adding, but it's again does the same thing. Like let me just make it more clear. It's using that static function which I created, which it will use that static function which I create to get the values of the city info, which is more like again a closure, but we'll have to make it a static function to do that. So let's get rid of this and then pass this, and we'll have to just call this function get city country, which is defined within this that single instance, which should not give an error. That's pretty much sorted now. So that's my use case. I have a closure function, closure, which I'm accepting here, and again it is again a closure, but that's just that it's being created as a static function, so that becomes again a input to your tuple, the same function. So let's also try calling that function here. Use case city for city result for static function is use case result dot city. No, I need to call that before that, static function, static use case result. Use cases. So you can see that the static city info is now coming up, and then again it will give you that same lat long error, missing arguments. See, it's city coordinates. Let's again pass that same thing for this as well. So static case result we are printing here, just city. Maybe I'll just print the country as well, just to differentiate. So pretty much there. Now we have whatever I did right now is, let's just run and see. So whatever I did is along with that closure I created, made this a static function which is accepting coordinates, type, and then returning. So you can see that it's printing that result. So that's the main thing about this tutorial. Overall intention of this tutorial was to show how a static function can be passed as a parameter to your tuple. In this case, I specifically called it as use case because in our example or in the application which we are building, you will have n number of interactors created, and there might be scenarios where you will have to pass some static functions as dependencies to different modules. In this case, let's say in my case, products might require user information, or it might even require some store information which might be residing in some, let's say, some other interactor. So if I have to pass it in a way where I can reuse some of the functions which is already created in my interactor, this is one of the good ways of doing it, where I pass it as part of a tuple and then consume it. So you can see that it's working. So that was the basic idea of this tutorial, where I had to show this feature, so along with explaining how tuples works. So hope this was very informative. If you have any comments, write your comments in the comment section. If you liked it, like and subscribe to this channel and keep supporting this. Until the next episode, which is actually trying to again lay some foundation for creating the e-commerce application, because we cannot just directly go with creating it without understanding what are the things or components which are really required to make it happen. So until the next time, bye from me.